Hello everyone. In this video, I'll explain the integration between Azure DevOps and Azure. Azure and Azure DevOps are two different platforms offered by Microsoft. And if you want your Azure DevOps pipeline to make changes in your Azure environment, then you need to create a service connection in Azure DevOps for Azure Resource Manager. There are 6 different ways in which Azure Resource Manager service connection can be created. And I'll explain each one of them in detail in this video. But the main focus in this video will be on the Workload Identity Federation, which is recently added by Microsoft for the integration of Azure DevOps to Azure. So let's start. As you can see on your screen, these are the 6 authentication methods used for the creation of new Azure Service Connection for Azure Resource Manager. The first one is Workload Identity Federation. It's a recent method added by Microsoft and it's the most recommended one too. The second authentication method is Workload Identity Federation, but it's done manually. The difference between automatic and manual is that in the case of automatic, when you create a service connection, all the configuration as well as the role assignments are done through Azure DevOps portal only. However, in the case of the manual, half of the configuration has to be done on Azure portal and other half during the creation of service connection. Same applies on the method number 3 and 4, which is service principal, automatic and manual. This authentication method was used till now, and now Microsoft recommends Workload Identity Federation. And the last two, which are managed identity and published profile, are very specific for a certain scenario, which we'll discuss further in this video. So let's cover each authentication method one by one. So let's start with service principal. It's an older authentication method which uses OAuth 2.2 authentication, where you create an app registration, which is also called as service principal, and the client secret of that service principal are shared with the Azure DevOps service connection. So that means Azure DevOps service connection has the credentials of service principal saved in them. And that service principal is provided role-based access control over Azure infrastructure. So whenever Azure DevOps pipeline wants to make changes to Azure environment, first they request the access token. And during the request, client ID and client secrets are shared in the API call. Then the Entra ID verifies those client ID and secret against the service principal. And once the verification is done, access token is provided to Azure DevOps pipeline. Then the changes are made to Azure using the Azure API with the access token. So this is the workflow of the service principal. Now there are two challenges here. One, because the client secret is saved in the service connection and the client secret is like credentials which are tend to expire. So by default they are created for 3 months and can go maximum for 2 years. So that means one fine day your Azure pipeline may stop working because the credentials has expired. And the another challenge is, if someone knows the client secret of the service principal, then they can log in through Azure CLI or PowerShell and run commands directly to Azure because that service principal is not mapped directly to the Azure DevOps pipeline. So these two were the challenges which were faced during the service principal connection. Now there are two ways in which service principal can be created. One is automatic, another one is manual. If you want to create a service connection using an automatic way, in that case, your user should have specific permissions like either global administrator or application developer in the Entra ID so that service principal can be created, and user access administrator on the subscription so that role-based access control can be assigned to the service principal. Because during the creation of service connection, it prompts you to log into Azure portal and then service connection creates everything in the background in the case of automatic. However, there are scenarios where Azure DevOps project is managed by the developer team, Azure infrastructure is managed by the infrastructure team. So in that case, Azure DevOps project user doesn't have appropriate permissions on Azure environment or Entra ID. So in that case, manual option has to be selected, where the infrastructure user will first create a service principal, then create the client secret, and then assign the required role-based access control to service principal on Azure environment. And then these details will be shared with the project user who will create a service connection using those details. So these are two different ways, automatic and manual. Let's check the creation of the service connection in Azure DevOps. Right now I'm logged into Azure DevOps and I am in the project Demo DevOps, which was created in the previous video. To create a service connection, we need to go to project settings. Then in the pipelines, service connections, and create a new service connection. This service connection is to integrate to Azure. So Azure Resource Manager has to be selected and next. And on your screen, as you can see, there are 6 different methods, but we'll start with the service principal automatic. Now it's prompting me to verify my credentials against the Azure Enter ID. So I'll quickly log in. My user has required permissions on Azure DevOps as well as Azure portal. So I'll be able to create a service connection using automatic method. So my subscription is selected. Let's select a resource group, RG DevOps test, service connection name, demo, SPN automatic. Let's copy the same and grant access permission to all the pipeline. Now it's setting up the connection. In the background, it's creating a service principal and then adding client secret to it. Those client secrets will be added to this service connection, and later that service principal will be provided with the role-based access control on the resource group which we selected. So service connection is created now. Let's go to the Azure portal and enter ID. Go to app registrations, all application, and you can see Lab Shailendra Demo DevOps. A service principal is created now. And if we'll go to the client secrets and certificate, I can see there is a client secret which is created. And this client secret is created automatically by the service connection. Now if we'll go to our resource group, RG DevOps test, and check the access control. In the role assignment, you will see that service principal is granted contributor level access. In the contributor, you can see the service principal. It's an app because it's a part of app registration and it's provided the contributor level access. But if we'll go to any other resource group, RG firewall, you will not see this service principal. But you can manually assign the permissions, add role assignment, reader level access, next, and you can look for the service principal. Lab Shailendra demo, select, review and assign, and assign. Now a reader level access is added. Somehow it's showing 2 times. Yeah, now it's 1. So the service principal is provided access on this resource group too. So that means now if Azure Pipeline wants to fetch some details from this resource group, they can use the service connection created in Azure DevOps account. Now let's create another service connection, Azure Resource Manager. And this time we'll select the manual option. Next. Now it's asking for subscription ID. Let's go and check the subscription ID. That's the subscription ID. Copy. Subscription name. Let's copy the name. And service principal ID, which is the client ID. But we haven't created the service principal yet. So let's create a service principal. App registration. Create a new registration. Demo SPN manual. It's for single tenant only, and register. And the client ID, let's copy it, save it here. And now there are 2 options of providing the credentials. One is service principal key, another one is certificate. let's use the service principal key. Go to the certificates and secrets, create a new client secret, SPN secret. By default, it's for 6 months, but you can extend it till 24 months or 2 years. Add. This is the only time when you will see the value and it will be removed later. So let's copy to clipboard and copy it here. Let's copy the tenant ID too. This is the tenant ID. And don't worry about the service principal key. I'll delete it before uploading this video. Let's create a service connection name, demo SPN manual. Same, copy, grant access permissions, verify and save. But we got error while saving this connection, and the reason is the service principal which we have created doesn't have any role-based access control provided over the Azure subscription. So let's go to Azure subscription, access control, and add the reader level access over the whole subscription. And demo SPN manual. This is the service principal which we have created. Select, review and assign, and assign. The role is assigned now. Let's wait for a few seconds and verify and save again. And as you can see, now the manual SPN is created. Now both the automatic and the manual service connections are created for service principal. And we select the manual in the case when a single user doesn't have permission on both Azure DevOps project as well as Entra ID and Azure subscription. So in that case, someone has to create a service principal, provide the client secret, and assign role-based access control over Azure subscription to the service principal. And using all those details, service connection is created. Now if we'll go back to Entra ID and to the app registrations, in both the cases, you will see the problem is the client secret is used and it has an expiry date. By default, it's 6 months, which can go up to 2 years, but still it's tend to expire. So in case if you haven't rotated your secrets on time, then all your pipelines will suddenly fail. Another drawback of using the client secrets in service principal is that there is no direct mapping between service connection and service principal. So if someone has the value of this client secret, they can use it in Azure CLI or PowerShell and run Azure API commands and using the credentials of service principal. And both of these issues are fixed in the next level of authentication, which is workload identity federation, which I'll explain next. But before that, let's remove the manual SPN. Delete. And delete it from service connections too. Workload identity federation is the newer authentication method and is now recommended by Microsoft too. It uses the OpenID Connect authentication, which is an extension to OAuth 2.0 authentication. So that means it provides an extra layer of security over the OAuth 2.0 authentication. So the background is same. It creates a service principal app in app registration, but instead of storing the client secret in the service connection, now service connection has the details about service principal, and the service principal has the user info details like the organization name, project, and its Azure DevOps, all these details saved in the federated credentials. So which means now there is a clear mapping between the services on both the ends. As the service connection knows which service principal is being in use, and the service principal knows where the request should come from. So if you'll understand the flow now, if Azure DevOps pipeline wants to make some changes in Azure, then it will request the access token from Entra ID. However, it has to provide the client assertion where the JSON web token is provided, which will have the user information. Then the Entra ID, using the information which it has saved in the federated credentials, will ask for the OpenID configuration using the JSON Web Token key system. And once those are verified, then the access token is issued to the Azure DevOps pipeline. And using that access token, Azure DevOps pipeline can make required changes into the Azure environment. So now an extra layer of security is added. As previously mentioned, in the service principal, there were client secrets involved. So now there are no client secrets. So that means the service connection will not expire. And the another one is there is no direct mapping between the user and the service principal. And in this case, there is a clear mapping between Azure DevOps project and service principal using the OpenID Connect. So this service principal cannot be used anywhere else apart from Azure DevOps pipeline. Let's check this in lab. I am in the project settings and service connection in the pipeline. Let's create a new service connection. Same for the Azure Resource Manager. And this time we'll select the Workload Identity Federation. Next. It will prompt to verify my credentials. And this verification is against Azure Entra ID. Resource group, let's choose the DevOps test. Service principal name, demo. Workload Identity Federation, auto. Grant access to all the pipelines, save. And it's setting up the connection. So in the background, it's creating the service principal, then created a federated credentials and assigning the role-based access control to that service principal. Now let's go to app registration, refresh. As you can see, another service principal is created. And in the client secrets, there are federated credentials. Now in the federated credentials, you can clearly see the token is from dev.azure.com, which is Azure DevOps. And the name of the organization, name of the project, and the name of service connection. All these details are saved. And it gets the token from Azure AD Token Exchange. So instead of using the client secret in service connection, now it's creating a mapping between the user and the SPN. And there is one more difference if you can see. In the certificates and secrets, there is no expiry. It's current, but it can be expired also. So there is no expiry involved. So both the drawbacks of service principal has been taken care in Workload Identity Federation. Let's go back to resource group, Azure DevOps, access control, role assignments, and you can see contributor level access is provided. So now let's create a new service connection where we'll use the manual method. Azure Resource Manager, select the manual method. Next, service connection name. So let's name it as demo WIF and manual. Same. And now it's providing the details of the issuer as well as the subject identifier. And these details have to be saved in service principal, which I'll create now. And I have to add the details of the subscription and authentication of the service principal ID and the tenant in here. So let's go to Entra ID, app registrations, new registration, demo, with manual 1, register, and in the client and secrets in the federated credentials, add the credential. So we'll use the other issuer. Let's get the details of the issuer and subject identifier from the service connection. Let's copy it from here Same, copy this one too. And let's name it. And audience is always Azure AD Token Exchange. Add. Now it's asking for other information, subscription ID. Let's get the subscription. Subscription ID. Subscription name. And the client ID of the service principal. Let's go back to service principal. App registrations. Demo wave manual. Let's copy the client ID. Tenant ID. Verify and save. And I think it will fail because we haven't added role-based access control to the service principal. Let's try. Yes, it failed. Let's provide access to a resource group this time instead of the whole subscription. Let's go to the resource group. Let's give access to RG storage, IAM, add role assignments, reader level access, select demo with manual, select review assign and assign. A reader level role is assigned to the service principal now. Let's try again, verify and save, and it's saved this time. So you can use both the methods. Automatic is definitely easy, but the user should have access on both Azure DevOps as well as Entra ID and Azure subscription. There is one more thing. If you want to add a very specific level of permissions to the SPN, in that case, you can go for manual too. Because in the automatic, you assign the contributor level access to a resource group which is selected. And there is no option to customize it while creating the service connection. But if you are creating it manually, then you can customize the role assignment to the SPN, and that way service connection will have the customized role assigned. So now let's delete the manual service connection. And from Entra ID 2, let's delete the app registration. Now one more thing which I wanted to show you. If you go to the workload identity federation service connection, it's all good. But if we go to the service principal, the older method authentication, now you can see there is a notification that you should be using workload identity federation and there is a way to convert it. So if you'll click on convert here, so you can revert it back in 7 days, but it will be converted now. It took few minutes, but now the service connection is converted to workload identity federation. And for the 7 days, you can always revert it to the original scheme. So let's check this in Entra ID. Refresh. And this was the one where the client certificates and secrets were there. Client and secret. Now, as you can see, there are client secrets as well as federated credentials. You can always revert it, so the secrets are saved for the next 7 days, and after 7 days these secrets will be removed and the authentication will happen using the federated credential, which is more secure way now. Now let's discuss the last two methods for creating the service connection for Azure Resource Manager, which is manage identity and publish profile. As you know, manage identity uses OpenID Connect and it's a service to service authentication. However, manage identity in this case can only be used if you are using the self-hosted pipeline agent instead of the Microsoft hosted. So if you're running a self-hosted agent into a virtual machine in Azure environment, then you can provide the managed identity to that virtual machine against the different resources in Azure environment. By that way, your pipeline will have access to those specific resources and can make changes in them. We can't test this now because I'm not using the self-hosted agent, but let's check what are the details which are required. So I will click on manage identity. Next, it asks for subscription ID, subscription name, tenant ID, service connection, and grant permission to all the pipelines. And parallelly, what you have to do is you have to go to the virtual machine in Azure environment and use the system assigned managed identity and assign the RBAC to that virtual machine managed identity. And once that is done, using this service connection, there will be a direct mapping between that managed identity of the virtual machine and this service connection. And your Azure DevOps pipeline can make changes in the Azure environment where the virtual machine has access to. And if we'll talk about the last option, which is publish profile, this option is specifically for Azure App Service, where the publish profile is created. It is an XML file which is also used by the VS Code. From VS Code itself, you can deploy an application to the web app directly, which is hosted in Azure App Service using the XML file, which is the publish profile. So when you create a web application in Azure App Service, you can download the publish profile, and using that publish profile, you can fill all those information. So it'll ask you for the resource group where the web app is lying. Then you have to select the web app because this is an automatic service connection. And when you'll select the web app and provide the service connection name, automatically it will get the details of the user and the password from the web app itself. It's not creating any service principal in the backend, but it's just directly saving the username and the password from the web app and then deploying it directly into the Azure environment using this service connection. So that's why managed identity and publish profile are the two options which have a very specific use case scenario. And that's the reason when you create a service connection in Azure Resource Manager, the recommended option always comes out to be Workload Identity Federation. Now to test whether the service connection is working, let's create a pipeline. But before that, let's remove one of the service connection because we just need one. So let's remove the SPN one. And this will remove the service principal too. Let's verify that. App registrations, all application, and there is only one service principal left. So now we have Workload Identity Federation service connection, which have service principal created in Azure Android. Let's create a new pipeline. Azure Git repo. First pipeline is the name of the repository which was created in the previous video. Start a pipeline, and let's name the pipeline as Azure Deployment Pipeline.yaml. I'll just copy paste the pipeline details. Copy the names. So I've set up the trigger as none. So that means if there are any changes in the Git repository, this pipeline will not be triggered. The pool is Ubuntu latest VM image, which is Microsoft Run Agent. In the variable, I'm selecting the Azure subscription, which is the SPN demo with auto. Resource group name as test my resource group, and location is Australia East. So there is one stage which is creating a resource group. Let's select as one. And there is one job which creates a resource group, display name, and the task is it's using Azure CLI and then running the command to create a resource group. Before creating resource group, we need specific permissions on that service principal, because when we created the service connection, only the contributor level access is provided over the resource group. But let's provide the contributor level access at the subscription level. Go to the subscription. IAM, add role assignment, privilege administrator, contributor, and select lab, Shailen, review and assign, review and assign. So role assignments and contributor level access is provided at the subscription level. So let's save and run this pipeline. You can commit with any message, and I'm committing directly to the main branch. It's creating the pipeline, and sorry, I've used hyphen. So let's edit the pipeline quickly. Validate and save. Save again. And run. It's queuing right now and it should trigger soon. And it has created the environment in Azure hosted agent and downloaded the Git repository there. Then it ran the Azure CLI. First it set up the environment for Azure CLI and then ran the command. And before running the command using the service principal or the service connection, it got access to the Azure environment. And once that is done, the resource group is created. And then the cleanup of the cache and the pipeline orphan processes. So let's go to resource groups and we can see there is a test my resource group created now. So that means using the service connection, our pipeline is running now. So to summarize this video, we discussed all the 6 different options used to create the service connection in Azure Resource Manager for the integration between Azure DevOps and Azure. And later, we tested the creation of the Azure resource using the service connection in the Azure DevOps pipeline. That's all for this video. I hope you liked it. Please like and subscribe. Thank you so much.